Buenas tardes. Quiero darle las gracias al School Improvement Network por invitarme a estar aquí con ustedes. Y especialmente quiero darle las gracias a Curtis Linton. Admiro mucho tu trabajo, Curtis. If you didn't understand that, I won't translate it, so good luck with that. I'm here today to talk to you about the conundrum we face at the University of Denver in our teacher preparation program. But really, this is a conundrum that people who are working with teachers to prepare them, to develop them in the schools, are facing across the nation. And it's really about our efforts to re-professionalize and rehumanize teaching and how we're using standards to do this. So we all know that there is a very bright spotlight on teacher preparation and development right now. That's why most of us are here. This spotlight really is about districts who are telling us, districts in Denver, districts from across the nation are telling us that we are not doing enough to prepare teachers to meet the needs of diverse students, particularly those who are English language learners or those who are culturally and linguistically diverse, students that have been marginalized and students that have been minoritized historically in this country. We're also struggling about how to evaluate effective teachers. What does this mean? How do we know they're effective? Do we use value-added measures? Do we use student surveys? Do we use parent surveys? Do we use administrative surveys? Do we use a combination? And so we're really struggling around how do we evaluate effective teaching. We're also struggling around retention. We all know the statistics on retention of teachers. They are dismal. And more than anything, we are struggling because we know we are leaving children behind. And we all know who those children are, even though it really is all of our children. When you look globally at the way that we compete globally, we know we're leaving children behind, particularly in math and science. But people often like to talk about the elephant in the room, and we know who we're leaving behind. There is no question. And so we know effective teachers are critical, and we know that they're especially critical in urban schools. But we don't often look at effective teaching or the definition of effective teaching from the eyes of minoritized populations or marginalized populations. And I want to share with you some stories, as the previous speaker did, around my own experience as an immigrant child in the United States going through U.S. schools. And this will help you understand my perspective on effective teaching and how I also challenge the definitions that we currently hold. I was born in Mexico, but I was brought to the United States by my parents when I was only 2 weeks old, and we lived in Denver. And so this bond with my mother country was broken. I never had the opportunity to really form a strong bond with my mother country. And in fact, people will ask me things about Mexico that I cannot answer. And often when I meet people, Mexican nationals, and I tell them that I brought to this country when I was only 2 weeks old, they'll say, well, then you're not a real Mexican. And unfortunately, I don't know that I can argue that, because there's a lot about my native country that I don't know. We used to visit Mexico in the summer and in December, and so my perspective of Mexico is really often of vacationing there. And so this was something that was very difficult, not to have this bond with my mother country, because even as I lived in this nation, I lived as the other. I will always be the other. I belong to what some scholars call the populations that are unmeltable. I will never be able to melt. People will always ask me, where are you from? And sometimes I'll say Denver, and they'll say, well, where are your parents from? And sometimes I'll say Denver, just to push them a little, and they'll say, well, where are your grandparents from? And they start to get a little uptight because they want me to be the other. And so I will always be the other in this nation. I will never be able to melt. And so my experience was really of a child living with one foot on either side of the border, but neither side wanted me. And so when we'd go to Mexico in the summer, the kids there would call us gringas, which is not a very nice word. I'm not sure if you knew that. But that would mean we were Americanized and we no longer belonged to the country. And so they did not see us as belonging to Mexico. But yet in this nation, we were always the other. This was my experience growing up, is really it's this no man's land or this no woman's land, this space that the Aztecs called Nepantla, this space where you just don't belong. But when I entered the school system, I entered in a bilingual classroom, and I brought my treasure box with me. My treasure box was filled with all of my treasures. It was filled with my language, my native language, my culture, the strength of my parents, my ways of knowing. And I had a bilingual teacher, Mr. Lopez. And Mr. Lopez taught me that I should really feel great pride in my treasures. And he took every single one of my treasures out of the box and held them with such care as if they were precious minerals, precious gems. He held my treasures, my language, my culture, my parents, my ways of knowing, and he helped me see them through the eyes of beauty, and he helped me feel a great pride in my treasures. But then I put all of my treasures back together, I put it in the box, and I was ready to travel to the first grade. Well, the first grade was a mainstream classroom, and so I was immediately mainstreamed into English, because we have to get those kids into English as quickly as possible, some people would say. And so I entered Miss Kowalski's classroom, and I hope she's not here today, because my recollection of Mrs. Kowalski was that she was really scary. And I did not enjoy the first grade. It felt really frightening. It felt really overwhelming. It felt really exhausting. My treasures were left in the box, and I was basically given the message that I should leave my treasures at the classroom door, that there was no space in this classroom for my treasures. And by the way, Mrs. Kowalski would give me a new box and fill it with new treasures, the English language, the U.S. culture, U.S. norms and ways of knowing. And so the message that I received without Ms. Kowalski ever saying a word, by the way, through the hidden curriculum, was that who I was did not have value, and who I was needed to remain in the box outside the classroom door. I could take that home and keep my treasures at home, but they had no place in the classroom. I can remember clearly, my teacher never said anything that I can recollect, but I remember being pulled out of my first grade classroom and being tested only in English. And so I remember them showing me a picture of an egg beater, and I don't know the word in Spanish anymore, but I remember thinking, I know it in Spanish, but I don't know it in English. I remember the red marks, right? Every time that I knew the word in Spanish, but I didn't know it in English, the red marks. And so immediately the messages that I started to receive was that, well, my language must not have value. It's not important enough to bring it into my education. And therefore, as a first grader, right, I started to unravel the thread. If my language doesn't have value, then my culture doesn't have value. Well, I started to unravel the thread a little more. If my culture doesn't have value, then my parents do not have value. And I was very ashamed of my parents, my immigrant parents with their thick accent, my father who left the third grade to help out on the farm, my mother who left in the sixth grade because she didn't need an education, she was just going to get married. And so I developed this really intense feeling of inferiority and that there was something wrong with people who looked like me. Plus, I never saw myself reflected in the textbooks or the literature. I never saw myself reflected in the history of the United States. Therefore, I did not have value. People like me never did anything. And so this really led me to go on and yearn for whiteness. I craved whiteness. I wanted to be white. And in the third grade, I started to pay very close attention to my peers. I started to dissect their every move. And I realized that the teachers favored them, that they were smarter, that they were affluent. And I wanted to figure out how they did it. And in the third grade at 8 years old, I became this connoisseur of whiteness, and I figured out that if I could get into the top reading group, then I would become white. And so I started to read voraciously. I paid such close attention during literacy class, and I started to improve my reading. The most exciting thing for me, which I won't admit to anyone else, was when the bookmobile came into the neighborhood. I guarantee the other kids didn't have the reaction I had, but I loved the bookmobile. So I started to become this great reader, and then that day came, and I was so excited. The teacher called my name, and she said I would be joining the Red Robins, and I knew it would happen that day. I just knew it. I knew that the color of my skin was going to turn white. I knew it, and I remember running home that day and looking in the mirror. All day I was looking in the mirror, looking down at my hands, and my mother was very concerned. She was wondering what the heck had happened to me at school, was wondering if I'd fallen in love with the boy who was sitting next to me, and why did the teacher sit me next to a boy? I remember hearing her conversations. What's going on with her? And I waited, and it didn't happen. And I thought, okay, well, maybe I need to work a little harder. It might take a little time. And I worked a little harder, and it never happened. And then I realized that I would have to live in my dark skin forever. I would forever be called La Morena or La Prieta. And so this really led me throughout my time in the educational system to do everything that I could to be successful, right? I worked so hard to be successful, and my teachers really were they effective? My teachers were effective. They closed the gap, right? They took this child who we can identify dropout markers in kindergarten. I had 3 or 4 dropout markers in kindergarten. Well, my teachers closed the gap, right? By middle school, I was in honors courses. By high school, I was in advanced placement courses. I graduated 10th in my class. If we had used value-added measures, my teachers would have been deemed effective and given rewards. But they taught me to feel ashamed of my language, my culture, the color of my skin, and my parents. Were my teachers effective? And was my success enough? Because my success has come at a heavy cost. It has come at the cost of my self-identity, and it has come at the cost of myself. Even today, as I'm at the University of Denver, which is a very privileged place, I am not like my colleagues. I will never be like them. I will be the first Latina tenured in the College of Education, the first woman of color tenured in the College of Education, and we've been around since the late 1800s. Even now, as I go into my community, as I spend time with my family, I'm not like them. I'm different. When I'm with my family, I have to be careful that I don't send messages that I think I'm better than they are, that I watch the vocabulary that I use, that I don't talk about research all the time, and that I'm careful about my opinions. And so I'm still in this no man's land, right? And so often people think that if we just get these marginalized, these minoritized kids into the college system, college and career readiness, effective teachers, then we've done all that we can do. But if our students are stripped of their language, their culture, their parents, their resources, then our teachers are not effective. Okay? This is how I define teacher effectiveness. Okay? An effective teacher sets high expectations. They scaffold teaching and learning. They work and begin with students' funds of knowledge as foundational to who they are. They infuse cultural relevance, but they go deeper. They don't just focus on fun, food, and fiestas. They help our students interrogate the messages they receive in society, the stereotype threat, and they teach them to go deeper. And they teach them to feel proud of who they are and where they come from. I have 3 children, and I teach them that greatness is in our blood. We can't help but be great. We come from indigenous populations that were phenomenal. We were scientists, we were doctors, we were educators. We come from greatness, and we can't help it. It's in our blood. And so how can we teach our children to go deeper, to go beyond the surface of culture? An effective teacher cares, but that means they must have high expectations. Most of my teachers cared about me, but they had what is called the pobrecito syndrome. Pobrecito means poor little one. And so what they did is they lowered the bar so low that we could just step over it, because they felt so sorry for us, and they thought that we could not achieve, that they lowered it to a point that we could just step over it. Our effective teachers raised that bar so high, they helped us get there, and they used our culture to do it, and they showed us in doing so that they cared. An effective teacher advocates for change, and they help students navigate the cost of an education. They help students understand what will be the cost as you continue to go through this system. What will you lose and what will you gain? An effective teacher really looks at giving students the culture of power, but also teaching them that they must maintain the power of their culture. My definition of effective teaching comes from my own experience as a student, but it also comes from my experience as a classroom teacher. I taught social studies, high school social studies, It also comes from research on effective teaching, seminal research that's current. It comes from organizations like the School Improvement Network, and it also comes from the InTASC standards. And a few of the speakers have talked to you about the InTASC standards today. The InTASC standards really hold my vision of what it means to be an effective teacher, and that's why I agreed to be a part of these standards. So I've been working with the Chief Counsel for State School Officers who commissioned the InTASC standards in 1992. I've been working with them on the revision of the standards. And we've been working on the revision for about 5 years now. And we have released, in 2011, we released the standards, and we're also working on learning progressions or rubrics of performance. And these InTASC standards really capture what it means to personalize learning, to apply knowledge and skills, to focus on assessment literacy, and to create a collaborative professional community. Now, these standards try to capture not only performance, but also knowledge and dispositions that will help us make teachers more effective. There are 4 categories of the standards: the learner and learning, content knowledge, instructional practice, and professional responsibility, and we intentionally focused on the learner first. And we intentionally focused on issues of diversity, issues of equity, and differentiation. Now, at the University of Denver, we are immersed in this conundrum of teacher preparation. As I was sitting at this table, Matthew, who is an assistant principal, says, "Oh, so we have you to thank for our teachers, huh?" And so now, in current times, universities are being reviled around the fact that we are not preparing teachers to be effective when they get into the classroom. And then districts have to really take that up and do a lot of development. So we've taken this head on, and we want to teach our teachers to speak the language of teacher effectiveness, but we also want to teach them to speak human. So we take behavioral approaches, we take cognitive approaches, but we also take sociocultural approaches to prepare our teachers to be able, again, to speak the language of teacher effectiveness, but also speak human. We use positivistic and humanistic lenses to re-professionalize teaching, but also to rehumanize it. Because again, you can be an effective teacher and you can steal my humanity. Okay? I'm going to say that again. You can be an effective teacher, yet you can steal my humanity. So in our program, we're really looking to focus on what are the skills, the behaviors, but what are the knowledge and dispositions for equity. And in our program, what we believe is that all children can learn if all teachers can reach them, not teach them. I'll say that again. All children can learn if all teachers can reach them. And this requires that we prepare teachers to be skilled technicians, reflective learners, committed leaders, fearless cultural workers, and relentless humanizing agents. And that they do this collaboratively to stand for educational equity and social justice. And we use the standards to really support that work across our curriculum. And we want to create teachers like Sophia, who's sitting over here at this table. Sophia, will you stand up, please? Sophia is a first-year teacher. Sophia is a first-year teacher in California, and her assistant principal describes her as a superstar. And I would bet that Sophia has many of these qualities that we have here before you today. And so we want to prepare every single teacher in 10 months, mind you, to be able to be effective so that they not only are effective in the technical sense, but that they humanize the experience of their students and themselves. And we also believe, as Dorothy stated, who is also at this table, Dorothy was talking about making sure that we are in education for humane reasons. And this is not only for students of color, this is for white students as well, so that they will be able to understand the humanity of other people who are different than them and really be able to connect on many different levels. In the session that follows, I will be able to really focus a little more about how we're using the standards to really create a teacher preparation program that creates effective teachers. Thank you.